You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. Join me as we uncover the rich histories of North America's Great Plains, exploring the latest archaeological discoveries and past cultures that shape this storied region. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to episode 14 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Carlton Shield Chief Gover, and I'm thrilled to have you join me on this exciting journey through the rich and fascinating histories of North America's Great Plains. Last time, 2 weeks ago, I bored everyone to death with an episode on the history of Great Plains archaeological taxonomy. Basically, it was an episode talking about the history of how did archaeologists come up with the system to talk about and compare and contrast and organize the archaeological record. Probably not everyone's favorite episode so far, but it was episode 13. And I was planning on today's episode to be jumping back into our quick march through time, and we're going to talk about the woodland period. But instead, I wanted to kind of move into pop culture for today's episode. And what I mean by that is I'm recording this episode February 15th. And recently, a AAA computer Microsoft game just came out called Sid Meier's Civilization 7. And for those of you who have listened to me on a previous podcast, Life in Ruins, you may know that myself and my co-hosts of that show, David and Connor, are huge Civilization fans. We often play together. We've co-op games since Civilization 5 and 6, and recently Civilization 7 came out. And I've been a follower of the franchise. I think my first Civilization game was Civilization 4 back in the 2005-6 era, so the early 2000s. And I remember having a friend who had Civilization 3. It was my first introduction to that game, but I never owned it. And the reason why I want to talk about it today is for two reasons. 2 weeks ago, the University of Kansas, the Office of Sovereign Partnerships and Indigenous Initiatives, helmed by Dr. Alex Redcorn and Lori Hasselman, put together an Indigenous Data Sovereignty Conference at the University of Kansas. And it wasn't just museums. Museums, we had a day, but it was how do tribes control access to data and information about their sovereign nations in a multitude of ways. And a presenter and guest of the conference was Chief Ben Barnes of the Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma. And he was one of the participants in the last roundtable talk of the conference after my session on some museum stuff. And one thing he had mentioned was hey, this is a grown adult. He is a chief of a major Oklahoma nation. He's get Civilization 7. And a bunch of other guys, councilmen and other adults in their 40s and 50s agreed, yeah, get Civilization 7. I was like, what the hell? Even Alex Redcorn was talking about it. And that's when I had learned that the Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma had been reached out to by Fire Access Games, the producers of Sid Meier's Civilization 7, that they had reached out to Chief Ben Barnes to make sure one of the civilizations and leaders in the game, were the Shawnee and Tecumseh, were depicted accurately. And so they reached out with the Shawnee Nation and Chief Ben Barnes to do so. I'd known Civilization was coming out. I had known the Shawnee were a nation that were being represented, and Tecumseh being a leader in this game. But I didn't know that there was a collaboration. And that's kind of been sitting with me. I got the game. I've been playing it for a few days. I got early access to the game. I went use some of that tenure track professor money to buy early access so I could be playing it. And it started, which led me to think about Native representation in general, And we don't have, like, I was like thinking about it. Have there been Great Plains tribes represented in media, in video games? Well, video game media. I shouldn't say in media in general, but just like I was thinking about video games and computer games, more specifically thinking more focused at the Civilization games. And so I've been playing Civilization since, like I said, Civilization 4. And there haven't been too many. So in the Civilization games, there's 7 of them. Technically, there's 8 if you count. There is 8. There's Civilization Alpha Centauri, which is a branch off from the franchise. But if we think about who's being represented in this game, so Civilization, I should probably explain a little bit of it. Sid Meier's Civilization is a turn-based strategy game where you, through Civ 1 through 6, you choose a leader who's associated with a nation, and you start from the Dark Ages all the way into the Future Era. And these games take hours to do, and you compete for resources and land with other civilizations chosen throughout time, with leaders chosen throughout time. Different civilizations they have an era that they excel in, where they might have a special unit, a special building that you could build these things in. Civilization deviates from that a little bit, and I'll talk about it. But since the first Civilization, the only Western Hemisphere civilization represented were the Aztecs. In Civilization 2, they had the Aztecs and the Sioux, which I didn't know. And I can't remember how old that game is. I didn't play Civ 2 at all. So I don't, probably not great. Civilization 3, there was the Aztec, Inca, Iroquois, and Mayan. Civ 4, where I started playing, we just had the Aztec, Inca, and Mayan civilizations. In Civ 5, they reintroduced the Iroquois, and then they added the Shoshone as a DLC. So, thinking through the entire time of Civilization, we've had 2 Great Plains nations represented, the Lakotas and the Shoshone, who were in the Northwest Plains in Wyoming. And I was curious, I'll get to that in a bit. And in Civilization, they had the Cree, Aztec, Inca, Mapuche, Mayan. Those were the ones represented. And in Civ 7, we have the Inca, Maya, Mississippian, Shawnee civilizations. And so it's not just the Shawnee, but Mississippians are represented. And I'll get to that here in a bit. But I thought the Aztecs were represented, but I may be mistaken. They might come out as a DLC. But in Civilization 7, there were articles coming out early on about when Civ 6 came out, and Cree were a civilization you could pick, and your leader was Poundmaker. The Cree were pissed because Fire Axis did not reach out to the Cree leader at the time of the nation that Poundmaker came from. They said the way that they were depicted in Civilization 6 and Poundmaker was inaccurate and detrimental to the image of the Cree. And didn't go so well. I wasn't aware of this. Usually if I played these Civilization games, I was always playing the Shoshone, but sometimes with the Iroquois, I played the Cree in Civilization 6. I kind of gravitated towards them. Oftentimes, though, my go-to is Germany, so I can get those Panzer tanks in the modern era or the atomic era, and just, anyways. And so when Civilization 7 was coming out, the Fire Axis already had the idea that they're going to go with the Shawnee. And apparently people internally were telling Fire Axis, their higher-ups, this is a bad idea. But they went ahead and reached out to Chief Ben Barnes, who I just saw a couple weeks ago, and I've known about him. And apparently Chief Ben Barnes is a Civilization fan. And so he was delighted and made this work. And I thought that was really interesting. And I highly doubt the Shoshone were reached out to at all about being represented in this game. And so when I just wanted to laud, not that anyone from, I imagine, Fire Axis listens to this podcast, or folks who are listening to this podcast like Carlton, without we're talking about Great Plains Archaeology, what the hell's going on? Why are we talking about a computer game? And part of that reason is that Sid Meier's did change things. And for those that are Sid Meier Civilization fans who know what I'm talking about, in previous games, 1 through 6 and Alpha Centauri, you chose a leader who was associated with a country or a civilization. Now you could have multiple civs, but with different leaders. So like sometimes the Russians, the Germans, even the Americans, there was a time in Civilization 4, each civilization had 2 different leaders you could choose that had 2 different bonuses, then 2 different units you could pick. In Civ 7, rather than having like this long game that goes from Dark Ages to where you have to, your first thing you got to discover is pottery, to future tech, is you chose a leader, and then they broke the game down into basically 3 sub games of, they made 3 eras, and you had like early or antiquity, age of exploration, and now you have modern. So that's how they did it. And I finished a game super quick the other night, well, relatively in terms of Civ, super quick. But within those ages, you can pick a new civilization that your leader can run, which has caused some controversy. I've enjoyed it. But part of that, though, is in this new era system. So Tecumseh, who's the Shawnee, he led the Shawnee people, which is a age of exploration civilization. You get bonuses if you match those 2 up. But in the age of antiquity, that first age, they added the Mississippian civilization, which I thought was really, really interesting. And so it also introduced wonders. Their mechanic in the game, their special tiles you produce or buildings you produce that give you different bonuses. And like you can build Monk's Mound as part of that. And you can have these Mississippian bonuses. And playing as Tecumseh, it like matches well to play the Mississippians, then the Shawnee, and then you play as the Americans in the modern empire. And like the tagline for that was like, Tecumseh lived in the country that would later become the United States. And so that's kind of how they kind of move it through. But playing as the Mississippians, I thought was like really, really, really cool addition to the game. That was an interesting addition that I don't think I've ever seen. The Mississippians, right? That culture from way back when, Cahokia being a prominent example, near modern day in St. Louis, and we have Mississippian influences in the Great Plains going up the Missouri River, the Ohio River, up the Mississippi proper. Seeing them represented felt really good. Like as an indigenous person coming from a tribe that isn't Mississippian or is not an ancestor of the Mississippians, but had interaction with them, to see them and parts of that, prominent period of time represented felt just incredibly wonderful. And it definitely made me like really want to text my tribal historic preservation officer in my cultural resource division and be like, can we send a letter to Fire Axis to have the Pawnee Nation represented as a DLC in this game? Because I think that'd be cool. But with that, we'll be right back with the second half of the episode. So we'll stay tuned for episode 14. And we're back to episode 14 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast, where this time we're talking about video games on a civilization from the southeastern United States. Well, technically Midwest. Anywho, that's just where I'm at. This is what happens when I have my own podcast. And hopefully for those of you that are Sid Meier's fans, you're kind of going along with this. As I was saying in the last segment, being the Mississippians as an early civ, and like anybody who chooses a leader, I think can choose the Mississippians as that first age civ. You get bonuses if you're like close, by to it, or it's a civilization that was like near the Mississippians, or a leader that is from the civilization that had some sort of relations to it. And then you can also unlock during at different points in that age, that era, doing certain things allows you to unlock a civilization to be used in the next era. So like, I believe I unlocked the Polynesians at some point, because I think I had a couple cities on a coast, and that unlocked, like, you have 4 cities on a coast. You can unlock the Hawaiians in the Age of Exploration era and stuff like that. And what was cool for at least the Mississippians, things that you got to deal with, is it was considered a goose society. So it was this unique ability that all buildings receive a food adjacency for resources. You can make a pot cop unique improvements, which gave you production towards constructing builders. You can unlock shell temper pottery as a it like gave you plus culture, +1 culture, +1 gold to certain resources that came in. And so they brought in like concepts and history from the Mississippians and introduced them as part of the game, which was like really cool. And also you got, as part of the Mississippians, access to a unique ranged bow and arrow unit that shot fire arrows, which was really cool. I did find it annoying at one point where I'd be like, I used a lot. Like in Civ 6, I realized very quickly that there are three kinds of units. You have like melee, ranged, and siege, and then you have like cavalry and anti-cavalry. But in Civ 6, ranged units kind of dominated a lot of combat. And so like in Civ 7, I produced like a lot of ranged units. And that flaming arrow unit like made the tile burn for like 2 turns, so you can continue to do damage. But if your own units walk through it, they'd catch on fire. So like I was like wiping out other units who I was at war with, and then like also denying access to their 2 places because I was burning it down. Anyways, just a whole different thing. And then you got Monk's Mound as the associated wonder, which is the big mound at Cahokia, the famous one. I got that name because in the 19th century, built their like a residence on top of it. That's how it got its name. But moving on to the next age, where you got to play as the Shawnee. The Shawnee civilization was pretty cool. And so like you can unlock this bread dance tradition where increased culture to all farming towns and increased food for all fishing towns. So you could grow your cities really fast. Adding gold to so they like adding gold to a trade route, but they incorporated a lot of Shawnee language into the game. So there was like a lot of crazy stuff like the Tewatiki and the Helikalilenapawipe stuff and different actions. So it's just like really cool. And as a tribal citizen to see a collaboration between Indigenous Nation and their leadership with a major AAA game developer to accurately represent this group of people within a game that, you know, because of this, like Civilization, let's see how many downloads. Civilization 7 sales. Let's just look it up real quick. I don't know how we could look it up, but anyways, it's also available via on Xbox too, because it's a Microsoft game. But there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, you know, adults, young adults, teenagers, kids who play Civilization, who are being introduced to the Mississippians and the Shawnee and Tecumseh in a way that it is really hard for an academic to do, or really hard for a historian to do, and to have worked with the Shawnee people and the Shawnee Nation to represent the Shawnee civilization. It was like really inspiring. And I wanted to take the time today to kind of bring that up. Like it was really neat to see. And I hope they continue on working with tribal nations. And from what I've been reading online, it was a good relationship. And like thinking about all of this and collaboration between 2 different groups in the context of like what's now being band-aided by the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, where even though NAGPRA has been around since 1990, some major revisions occurred in 2024, that it's a lot of folks have been scared to engage with Indigenous nations regarding NAGPRA. But like if a AAA game developer can successfully work with a tribe, you know, pretty much anyone can. Like there was a lot of flack in Civilization 6. The Cree were really not happy about how they were represented. And so it could be really easy. Like there was nothing that Sid Meier's team, they didn't have to work with the Shawnee, but they chose to. They chose to take the criticism of what happened in Civ 6, learn from it, and then do the right thing for the next game. Right? Archaeology, especially with NAGPRA work or working with communities in the Great Plains, like there's been a lot of not great things that have happened in the past, right? And contemporary archaeologists and students have to deal with the history of the discipline. And even though we ourselves did not commit those sins of the past, we are responsible for them as we move on to the professional space. And like this is a pretty good lesson for moving on and doing better. And yeah, I just thought it was really cool. I think, do they have Tecumseh in No, civilization is fine. Shawnee and Tecumseh, my bad. I was thinking of something completely different. I was thinking Shoshone. I'd be curious to know what the Shoshone thought about their representation. I imagine Civilization 2, which was like a 2D game in the 90s, they didn't do the Sioux any favors. But like, I'd like to actually hear from Cree and Iroquois. Like the Iroquois were in Civ 5, I believe. Yeah, they're Civ 5. Like, I'd actually really like to know, and their leader is Hiawatha. Like, I'd like to know how Cree, Iroquois, and Shoshone people feel about how they were depicted in those games. Because, like, I kind of feel bad for playing as them. Because, even though I'm not from those tribes, I have family that are Shoshone. I lived out in Wind River. I know Shoshone folks, so I always had the opportunity to play as Shoshone, but I actually really never thought if there was that collaboration. And like Civ 5 came out when I was in high school or college. Civ 6 came out when I was in grad school, and I never really thought about it. And like, I always gravitated towards playing those civilizations because they were North American indigenous. Anywho, so that's just kind of it. It was a fun game. For those that who listen to this podcast, I have no idea actually how well this podcast is doing. I should probably talk to Chris or Rachel. But for any of the listeners out there who play Civilization, like if you'd like to play with me sometime, hit me up on Instagram. I probably should check the email I have for Great Plains Archaeology Podcast and see if I have any respondents. But yeah, if you guys play this game, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to play Civilization with more people. I love playing with David and Connor. Although I will say, like, I've learned playing with Connor for David, I can't trust David at this game. David is incredibly devious at Civilization. He cannot be trusted. But with that, we're going to end the episode a little bit early today. I swear, this is the last. We've gone off on a couple tangents these past couple episodes, talking about Lance, hit on really boring topic last time, taxonomy, and now I'm talking about video games. But next week we will talk about, or the next episode, we will talk about Great Plains Woodland, and then we'll talk about Plains Village Contact, and we'll start looking into some sites and stuff that I do. So for those of you guys that are enjoying the podcast, please leave a like. Please rate the podcast. Please let me know how I'm doing. If there's any topics you guys want me to cover, I'm about to open up the Gmail account now and see if there's anything waiting. So with that, hope to hear from you guys. I'd love to play some Civilization games with any of you who are listening, but I will see you next time. Thank you for listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at Pawnee_archaeologist, and you can also email me at greatplainsarchpodcast@gmail.com. And remember, anybody can love the mountains, but it takes a soul to love the prairie. American author Willa Cather.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.